It was a bitter January morning in the quiet hills of Pike County, Pennsylvania, 1957, when Evelyn Hart turned the brass key of her late great-uncle's home for the first time. A fine dust clung to every surface inside the sprawling Victorian house, as if time itself had chosen to settle in its corners. She hadn't planned on coming here, but not really. But the inheritance letter was insistent, handwritten in the now familiar looping script. "You'll find what I couldn't. It's all in the attic." Evelyn had spent most of her adult life unraveling the mysteries of dying dialects and lost tongues. A retired professor of linguistics, she'd seen ancient scripts in Turkish caverns and heard prayers whispered in forgotten tribal syllables. But nothing, not even her years in the field, prepared her for what waited beneath that sagging attic door. The trunk was black leather, iron-cornered, sealed tight with a clasp engraved KB. She recognized the initials instantly. Konrad Boimler, her great-uncle's mentor, a name she'd seen only in marginal footnotes of pre-war linguistic journals. Inside, wrapped in linen and aged wax paper, were 2 wax phonograph cylinders and a bundle of yellowed photographs tied with twine. She knelt beside the trunk and carefully unwound the twine. The photographs were stiff with time, matte black and white, each depicting 2 identical girls, pale faces, jet black hair, eyes almost too dark for the camera to capture. The caption on the back of the first photo read, in faint German script, "Lise und Anneliese Halden, Wien, 1904. Evelyn blinked. She flipped to the next. Same girls, older perhaps by a year, standing before a low stone building. A hand-scrawled note. Sanatorium Heiligenkreuz, Aufnahme 1905. She paused. That facility had burned down in 1907. She remembered the article. Then came the most curious item. A note folded inside a cracked envelope. Written in the same looping script as the inheritance letter, it read, "They never should have recorded them. But now you must listen. Not to understand, but to hear. Only to hear." Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the phonograph from its case. It still worked. She wound the crank, set the needle, and placed the first wax cylinder into position. The machine clicked, whirred, and with a scratch began to play. Children's voices. 2 of them. Female, high-pitched, synchronized. But not English, not German, not any language Evelyn had ever encountered. It was rhythmic, almost melodic, with an undercurrent of something metallic. She couldn't place the phonemes. The syllables were sharp, then elongated, then reversed on themselves in impossible sequences. She rewound the cylinder and listened again, and again. Her academic instincts kicked in, note patterns, stress markers, root consonants, but there were none. The speech defied structure, yet it was undeniably language. The cadence was too precise, the harmony between the voices too intentional. A third time, the same eerie synchronization. It was almost hypnotic. She sat back on the attic floor, heart racing. Whoever the Halden twins were, this was not performance or gibberish. This was communication, purposeful, intentional, possibly not human. She stood, clutching the cylinder in one hand and the note in the other. If this was real, if the language was unrecorded, if these children were speaking something unknown to all human catalogues, it would be the greatest linguistic anomaly of the century. But as the final phoneme echoed in her mind, something cold slid down her spine. Because for a brief moment, just a blink, she thought she'd understood a word, one word, in a language no one taught her, spoken by children dead for 50 years. If this story grips your curiosity, subscribe to the channel to uncover the unsolved mysteries we bring to light. The next morning, Evelyn returned to the attic. The cylinder still sat where she'd left it, but her mind couldn't stop circling the sound. The voices had followed her in dreams, soft, almost coaxing, repeating that same incomprehensible phrase. It stirred something unsettling deep inside her, like a melody she hadn't known she knew. She brought the photos downstairs to the parlor and spread them across the table, under the filtered light of a lace-curtained window. The Halden twins stared back from every image, always together, never smiling, their eyes locked on the camera with a calm far beyond their years. No photo captured them mid-movement. They appeared as statues, pale, perfect, unnervingly still. Evelyn examined the back of each photograph again. Dates and locations were handwritten in faded ink, some in German, others in English, but something didn't align. One image, dated April 1906, showed the girls in a classroom labeled Akademie für Sprachkunde, yet the institution didn't appear in any registry. Another, dated December 1907, placed them at a convent near Salzburg, but Evelyn remembered reading that the building was destroyed in a flood in 1906. Her fingers paused over a small photograph tucked at the bottom of the bundle. This one was different. The twins stood beneath an arched stone gateway, and carved above them were the words Stift Heiligenkreuz. Their hands were clasped, faces still expressionless. But what caught Evelyn's eye wasn't them, it was the shadow behind them. A third shape, faint, blurred, barely visible. It wasn't a trick of light. Her pulse quickened. She moved next to the journals, dozens of pages written in her great-uncle's hand. But his writing here was different, rushed, desperate. Most entries detailed his correspondence with Dr. Konrad Bäumler in Austria. They discussed the girls, the language, and something they called verlorene Frequenzen, lost frequencies. One note stood out. They speak in patterns the ear barely registers. It isn't just sound. There's something beneath it. A pulse. You don't hear it, but it changes the air. Another passage chilled her. I recorded the cylinder as he instructed. Only once. It was enough. After that, they refused to speak again. And thank God. My assistant has not spoken a word in 3 days. He mimics their gestures in his sleep. She flipped further until a folded letter slipped from between the pages. The paper was brittle, the ink browned by age, but the handwriting was unmistakably different. Thinner strokes, unfamiliar spacing, yet somehow symmetrical. The letter was addressed simply, "To whom finds us?" It was written in a mixture of German and another script Evelyn didn't recognize. Some characters were Cyrillic adjacent, others wholly alien, like a constructed language with its own internal logic. What struck her wasn't just the shapes, but the eerie precision. Each letter mirrored the next. Even in chaos, there was order. She stared at the page, heart pounding. And as she did, the lines began to pulse in her vision, subtly but undeniably, as if the ink itself was moving. Pulling herself away, she tucked the letter back in the journal and closed the book with trembling fingers. There were too many impossibilities stacked together. 2 girls from 1904, photographed in places that no longer existed, or hadn't existed yet. A language no one could identify. Recordings that altered the minds of those who heard them. But she wasn't frightened. Not yet. She was compelled. She needed to know more, not for fame or science, but because something in those voices whispered not just to her intellect, but to her very sense of being. Like they knew her, had waited for her, had spoken with intent. And as she turned the final photograph over again, a single word stood out in shaky pencil. Listen. Evelyn hadn't intended to involve anyone else. But the questions piling in her mind demanded sharper tools than even her years of study could provide. She mailed a copy of the audio to Dr. Albert Kessler, a colleague from her university days and a respected expert in acoustic phonetics. She enclosed no explanation, only a note. "Can you identify the phonemes?" Kessler called 3 days later. His voice, usually brisk and rational, was low, uncertain. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Evelyn hesitated. "Old family records," he exhaled sharply. "This isn't any language I've ever heard. Not constructed, not natural. The patterns repeat, yes, but in ways that violate linguistic symmetry. It's like someone designed it to sound like language without following the rules." She asked him what stood out most. "The harmonics," he said. "They shouldn't exist." Evelyn pressed further, and his voice grew quiet. "There's something beneath the voices, a tone that oscillates just below hearing range. I ran it through a spectrograph. There's a frequency embedded between 17 and 19 hertz. She frowned. "That's infrasound." "Yes." It's not consciously detectable, but it affects the body. Nausea, anxiety, hallucinations in extreme cases. I don't know how or why it's there, but it's not an accident. After they hung up, Evelyn sat in silence, listening to the ticking of the mantel clock. Infrasound embedded in a 1904 wax cylinder. Impossible. But Kessler was not easily rattled. That night, Evelyn listened to the recording again. She told herself it was research, yet something pulled at her, a strange, invisible thread. The voices were the same as before, but this time she noticed a new element, a pulsing rhythm, not in the speech itself, but behind it, like the beat of a hidden metronome. When the cylinder stopped, the room felt different, the air heavier, the shadows deeper. She couldn't sleep. The next morning she retrieved her old notebooks and began transcription. She mapped out the phonemes by sound alone, ignoring meaning. She recorded pitch, duration, inflection. The symbols she used were custom. No existing alphabet matched what she was hearing. After 4 hours, she had less than 2 minutes of transcription. She stepped back and scanned the marks. Something about them looked wrong, or perhaps too right. There was symmetry not only in the sounds, but in their visual structure. The lines mirrored each other, folded in strange ways, like a palindrome in sound. It felt less like a transcription and more like a design, like music or math. Then the headaches began. It started as a pressure behind her eyes, dull but insistent. Her ears rang faintly at night, even in silence. Sometimes, just before drifting off, she'd hear whispers. Not words, not yet, just tone and pulse and breath. She stopped sleeping with the cylinder in the house. Kessler wrote again. He'd shared the audio with a younger colleague specializing in computational linguistics. The man, brilliant and reckless, had tried running a decoding algorithm. Then he vanished. His wife found him at dawn, sitting in their study, rocking silently. He had scrawled glyphs across the walls, mirror images of Evelyn's notes. He hadn't spoken since. Kessler urged Evelyn to destroy the recording. It's not just sound, he warned. It's something else. It behaves like a virus, not biological, not digital. Cognitive. It spreads through pattern recognition, through attention. But Evelyn couldn't stop. Not now. The journal entries, the photos, the symmetry in every step. The language, if it was that, wasn't static. It was alive, reactive, recursive. And when she closed her eyes, she could almost hear them calling again. Two voices perfectly synced, not asking, not demanding, inviting. Vienna, January 1904. The city was quiet beneath a fresh layer of snow, its rooftops glistening in morning light as Dr. Konrad Bäumler stepped out of the streetcar and adjusted his scarf. The letter had arrived 3 days prior, sealed with the emblem of the Ministry of Social Welfare. It requested his immediate assessment of 2 miners, recovered from the ruins of a monastery fire in Lower Austria. He was no stranger to the unusual. As a child psychologist trained in both neurology and early language acquisition, Bäumler had treated everything from catatonia to echolalia. But the urgency of this request, and the lack of any identifying information, stirred something more than professional curiosity. He arrived at the gates of the private sanatorium, nestled in the Heiligenkreuz woods. The air was sharp with pine and soot. The head matron greeted him with a tight expression. "They haven't spoken since arrival," she said. "Except to each other." He was led to a narrow observation room with a glass partition. Beyond it, seated on twin stools in matching grey dresses, were the children, identical, around 8 years old, pale skin, dark eyes, motionless as he entered, but alert, watching. "Lisa and Anneliese Halden," the matron said. "They were found alone in the remains of the abbey." Everyone else was lost in the fire. No records, no relatives. Bäumler stepped closer to the glass. The girls didn't react, didn't move. But suddenly they turned to each other and spoke. His breath caught. It wasn't whispering. It wasn't gibberish. It was language, structured, rhythmic, with shifts in tone and syntax. It rolled and looped in patterns unfamiliar to any Indo-European base he knew. He turned to the matron. "Have they spoken in any known tongue?" "They understand none," she replied. "Not even gestures, but they communicate constantly, only with each other." He requested a phonograph. For 3 hours that day, Boimler sat behind the glass and recorded them. They didn't resist. They spoke freely, eyes locked on each other, expressionless. No inflection of emotion, just an endless exchange, sometimes in rapid bursts, other times with long pauses as if contemplating precise phrasing. That evening, he listened to the first cylinder. Then again. Then again. The cadence made no sense, yet it echoed something beneath the surface of comprehension. A loop of recognition just out of reach. He began transcription, but even phonetic mapping proved difficult. The vowels were mutable, consonants softened and hardened unpredictably, but it wasn't chaos. There was intention. On the second night, something changed. He entered the observation room alone against protocol. The twins were waiting, silent, as if expecting him. He sat. "Lisa?" he said gently. Neither responded. He tried again. "Annalisa?" Still nothing. Then, in perfect unison, they tilted their heads and spoke. The sound rose like vapor, not volume, but resonance. He felt it in his teeth, his chest. They stopped, blinked, waited. He swallowed hard. What does it mean?" No answer. Just silence. Then one of them, he couldn't tell which, reached into her dress pocket and held out a folded slip of paper. A single line was drawn across it, not words, but a series of vertical and curved marks, repeating in mirrored patterns. He took it, thanked them. They watched him leave, expressionless as ever. That night, he sat with the recording and the drawing, running his fingers over the wax grooves, hearing their voices again. There was something there, more than language, a structure hidden in repetition, a pulse, not mechanical, but alive. And for the first time in his career, Dr. Konrad Boimler felt out of his depth, not because he didn't understand them, but because something in him feared that, if he listened long enough, he would. The following weeks blurred into a silent obsession. Dr. Boimler visited the twins daily, recording, observing, documenting, yet the more he tried to decipher their language, the further it slipped from clarity. It obeyed rules, yes, but not human ones. Syllables reversed mid-sentence, emphasis changed meaning. And sometimes they spoke in perfect mirrored synchronicity, creating an auditory symmetry that made transcription nearly impossible. Despite their youth, the girls displayed none of the emotional responses typical in children. They did not laugh, they did not cry. They showed no fear, no joy, no attachment, only precision and presence. Boimler tried everything. He introduced images, objects, sounds. The twins responded only in their language, adapting terms that didn't exist to describe what they saw. When shown a clock, they used a series of sharp, ticking syllables. When shown fire, their words curled and hissed. He began cataloguing their lexicon, assigning symbols to each sound, but the structure refused to hold. The words changed subtly with each context, like a living algorithm. What troubled him most, however, wasn't the language itself. It was what it did to those who listened. On the fourth week, a nurse named Greta, young and bright, volunteered to sit with the twins for an afternoon while Boimler reviewed his notes. When he returned, Greta was sitting on the floor, eyes wide, whispering phrases she couldn't translate. She was dismissed the next day, but even as she left, she muttered the same phrase under her breath, over and over. Later that week, one of the other children, a boy of 6 recovering from night terrors, began mimicking the twins' gestures. He hadn't been exposed directly, only heard them through the wall, yet he mirrored their hand motions and made low rhythmic noises that didn't belong to any known language. By morning, he was comatose. The doctors insisted it was psychological shock. Boimler wasn't so sure. He began limiting staff exposure. Only he and one assistant were permitted in the observation room. Recordings were sealed and stored. Still, the incidents continued. One orderly claimed to hear whispering in the halls at night. Another woke screaming from a dream in which the twins stood above his bed, speaking not to him, but through him, as if his voice were merely a conduit. Despite mounting pressure from the administration to relocate the girls to a permanent institution, Bäumler resisted. He insisted on the uniqueness of the case, on the scientific value. But in private his notes grew frantic. Their syntax is not linear, it folds upon itself. When I listen for more than an hour, the rhythm invades my thoughts. I dream in echo. I no longer believe this is language as we define it. It is architecture, a structure of thought externalized. Still, he kept returning. Each day the twins greeted him the same way, not with words, but with a fixed gaze and immediate speech. Always together, always as one. They never asked for food, they never aged. And the drawings. They had begun drawing on the walls of their room, symmetrical symbols, recursive spirals, sequences of dots and lines. They looked mathematical, musical, familiar, yet undecipherable. He tried to photograph them, but the images blurred, as if the shapes resisted being captured. On the 28th day, he asked them a question. "Do you know what language you speak?" They looked at him, tilting their heads in perfect unison, and answered slowly, "No one taught. We remember." He stared, breath frozen. Remember? From where? But before he could ask again, they resumed their private exchange, ignoring him completely. The voices rose, fell, interwove, and in the cadence of their speaking, he felt something stir in the back of his mind, not understanding, recognition. The following morning the girls were gone. No broken locks, no forced doors, no footprints in the snow outside the sanatorium. Their room was silent. Still, empty. Only the walls remained, covered in symbols, scorched black where once there had only been chalk-white plaster. Panic overtook the staff. Nurses refused to enter the room. Orderlies packed and left without waiting for wages. Marta handed her resignation to Bäumler in silence, trembling as she did. Her hands bore faint bruises shaped like small fingerprints. No one asked why. The sanatorium attempted to contain the news. A fire had damaged one of the upper wings, it was said. A clerical error had misplaced patient records. But rumors spread quickly in the quiet Austrian countryside. People spoke of voices heard through winter fog, of children seen standing hand in hand at the forest's edge, unmoving, watching. Bäumler locked himself in his office. He listened to the recordings over and over, hoping for a clue, a pattern, a message. His notes became erratic. Words spiraled across the page. He stopped writing in German, began drawing instead, loops, mirrored glyphs, latticed geometries that meant nothing and everything all at once. He wrote letters, dozens, to universities, scholars, even the Vatican. Few responded. Fewer took him seriously. And those who did stopped replying after he sent the audio. One professor from Prague wrote only a single phrase before ceasing all contact. "This is not for us." In March of 1905, the sanatorium was quietly shut down by order of the ministry. The official reasons cited financial insolvency, but those who'd been inside knew better. Patients had begun speaking in strange tongues, tracing invisible symbols in the air. One nurse had thrown herself into a frozen creek, another walked barefoot into the woods and was never found. And through it all the recordings remained, stored in a black leather trunk, marked only with the initials K.B. Bäumler was never the same. He wandered Vienna like a ghost, muttering to himself, pages of symbols spilling from his coat pockets. He claimed to hear them, not just the voices, but the thoughts beneath them. Claimed he'd seen them in mirrors, said they were not gone, only elsewhere. In August of that same year, he was committed to a private asylum in Graz. Diagnosis: progressive aphasia with paranoid delusions. But even sedated, even strapped to a bed, he continued to speak. Not in German, not in Latin, in the language of the twins. The attending physicians could not identify it. Linguists brought in to analyze his speech left early, some refusing to ever return. One assistant tore his own notes to pieces after transcribing a single hour of Bäumler's mutterings. When asked why, he simply said, "It's not meant to be heard twice. Eventually, Boimler stopped speaking altogether. He spent the rest of his days staring into a cracked mirror hung opposite his bed, tracing invisible symbols into the air. He died in 1924. The cause was listed as cognitive erosion. His final journal, a stack of folded, brittle sheets, was never published. Passed hand to hand, it eventually reached a young linguistics professor in Pennsylvania. His name was Walter Hart, and decades later, that journal would pass to his great-niece, Evelyn. But in 1905, none of that was known. All anyone could say, in hushed tones and careful whispers, was that the Halden twins had vanished. No bodies, no traces, only their words remained, and they were still echoing. The snow returned the day Evelyn found the journal. She had spent the morning combing through the cellar, where the scent of oil and mildew lingered thick in the air. A forgotten trunk sat beneath rotting blankets, tucked into the shadows like something left behind on purpose. Inside were notebooks, leather-bound, brittle-edged, and at the bottom a flat wooden case with brass hinges. Her fingers paused on the initials carved at the top, KB. She carried it upstairs in silence. Back in the parlor, she opened the largest journal. The pages were filled with narrow handwriting, perfectly aligned, until it wasn't. As she turned the pages, the language shifted, from German to phonetic transcriptions, then to the glyphs she'd seen in the photos. The ink darkened, then lightened. The handwriting fractured. It wasn't just notes, it was dissent. One phrase recurred again and again. They were not born of time. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read. These weren't clinical observations, they were warnings. One entry described the sensation of losing vocabulary. Another spoke of recursive dreams, always twin figures, always whispering backward. Then, in one of the final pages, Boimler wrote, "Walter understands now, he has heard them. I told him not to listen, but he played the cylinder anyway. It spoke back." She sat back, the breath gone from her lungs. Her great-uncle had known. He had heard the voices too. The cylinder, the photos, the inheritance, and it wasn't coincidence. He had chosen her, left it all for her, and she had listened. That night, Evelyn dreamed again. The same dream, the corridor of mirrors, the sound of breathing in unison. But this time she didn't wake in panic. She woke, speaking. The words were nonsense at first, sharp consonants, elongated vowels. But when she stopped, she felt something strange. Clarity, not meaning, not translation, but the sense of having said something real. She recorded herself. The playback made her nauseous. Her voice distorted, layered, as if another tone was embedded beneath it. She slowed it down, isolated the waveform, the same pulse as the twins. For hours, she sat frozen. The journal, the photos, the symbols on the wall in the sanatorium, the mirrored structures of their language. It was all the same shape, repeating through time. Boimler's final passage burned in her memory. "I no longer believe this is language. It is a mechanism, a pattern of cognition not bound to human minds. It uses us to remember itself." She thought of Kessler's colleague, the seizures, the drawings, the whispering. What if Boimler was right? What if this wasn't just a linguistic anomaly, but a viral structure? Not code, not sound, but thought. A pattern that infected awareness, a language that rewrote the mind. She went to the mirror, stared into her own eyes, and whispered one of the phrases again. The air shifted. Her breath fogged the glass. Something flickered in the reflection, not behind her but beside. A shimmer of doubled symmetry. She turned fast. Nothing. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The voices had rooted themselves. Not in the room. In her. They weren't visitors. They were home. And as she sat in the stillness, the final pages of Boimler's journal open beside her, Evelyn knew something with cold certainty. She had not discovered them. They had found her. It started with a rumor at the local grocer. Evelyn stood in line behind an older man, a farmer judging by the state of his boots, who mentioned a strange sighting near the tree line behind the quarry. Two girls, standing still in the dusk, hand in hand, whispering backwards. She stiffened. The cashier chuckled nervously. Probably just kids playing dress-up. The man shook his head. Not in this weather. And not barefoot. Evelyn said nothing, but that night she drove out toward the area. The road turned to gravel, then to dirt. The woods loomed, silent and watchful. She stopped where the forest thickened, headlights off. The air felt wrong, not cold, dense, weighted. She stepped out, flashlight in hand, and followed the faintest trail into the trees. Her boots crunched over dead leaves. Then silence, total, not a single insect, not a single rustle. Then she saw it, an old shed, half collapsed, overtaken by moss and vine. She pushed the warped door inward. Inside, dust and rot, but also markings. Carved into the wood along every wall were symbols, shallow, precise, some fresh. She ran her fingers over one, heart racing. They matched the drawings from the sanatorium. Loops, spirals, lattices, the language, or at least its bones. Then she saw the names, etched in the center beam, one above the other. Liese, Anneliese, the date below, 1906. She staggered back. That was impossible. This place wasn't even built then. And yet, the wood showed no signs of recent tampering. The cuts were old, weathered, real. Behind her, something creaked. She spun, flashlight trembling. Nothing. But again the air. Thicker now, pressed inward. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Listening. Evelyn left, fast. Back home she locked every door and pored over the journals again. Her own voice was beginning to change when she read aloud from the symbols. Her accent shifted. Her tone slid. She caught herself humming, not tunes but phrases. The language wanted out. And it wasn't just in her. A week later she received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, recent, color. Taken from a distance but unmistakable. 2 girls in grey dresses standing at the edge of the woods near the quarry. Same faces, same stance, same eyes. She flipped the photo over. No writing, just a symbol, carved in pen. A spiral mirrored on itself. She didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, because of recognition. The whispers weren't hallucinations anymore. They had rhythm, grammar. She could parse fragments now, not full sentences, but enough to feel proximity, the way one feels a storm before it arrives. The voice was no longer outside her. It was internal, embedded. One phrase repeated constantly without variation, always in tandem, always in the same tone. Not gone, not yet, not gone, not yet. She wrote it down, and as she did, her hand moved on its own. Not automatic, purposeful. She watched, frozen, as her fingers etched the same mirrored glyph the girls had carved in the shed. It looked like a map, or a door, or a trap. Evelyn stared at the shape. And for the first time since she'd found the cylinder, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Dread. Not fear of the unknown, but fear of knowing exactly what came next. Evelyn stopped trying to fight it. Each time she resisted, each time she avoided the recordings, burned her notes, left the house, the pressure only grew. Her thoughts twisted, looped, echoed. The language wasn't spreading through documents or sound anymore. It was inside her, and she wasn't alone. Word had gotten out in small circles. Linguists, parapsychologists, even a few underground archivists had caught wind of her research. She received letters, packages, sometimes enthusiastic, more often frantic. One envelope, postmarked from Oslo, contained pages scrawled with mirrored glyphs and a warning. Do not record yourself. Too late. Others weren't as lucky. She learned of a professor in Montreal who'd tried isolating the base structure of the twins' language through waveform compression. His assistants found him seated at his desk, bleeding from the ears, eyes open and unblinking. On the wall behind him were hundreds of etched circles, each one containing a single vertical line. She learned of another in Marseille who attempted phonetic transcription and went mute. Her final notebook contained a single sentence, written backward. The words are not for speaking. Evelyn watched helplessly as the evidence grew. This was not language in the traditional sense, not a tool for communication but a force of recursion, a viral architecture, thought infecting thought. And still, she kept listening. The cylinder's resonance grew stronger. When she played it, the sound distorted the room. Shadows deepened, corners curved. Her clock ran backward for 21 minutes. Her reflection flickered once, slightly delayed. She stopped playing it out loud, but she couldn't stop hearing it. The worst part wasn't the hallucinations or the whispers. It was the realization that she was beginning to understand certain phrases now translated without effort, not into English but into concept, memory, feeling. One word meant to enter without moving. Another, to echo across thresholds, and a third, which repeated endlessly, to remain. She wrote to Kessler one last time, told him everything, her fears, her transformation, her suspicion that the recordings weren't merely echoing the twins, they were becoming them. Or worse, allowing something else to become her. He never wrote back. 3 nights later, a former student of hers, now teaching at Yale, called in a panic. He had played the digitized version of the cylinder to his class. "I thought it was a hoax," he said, voice shaking. But then one of them started speaking it, fluently. "She's never studied linguistics. She doesn't know a second language." Evelyn asked what the girl said. He hesitated. "She told us we wouldn't remember her face tomorrow." He was right. The next day, no one in the class could describe her, not her hair, her eyes, her name, only that she had been there. For Evelyn, it was no longer a question of what the twins had spoken. It was a question of how far their reach extended, and whether the language had ever needed them at all. It lived in recordings, in carvings, in dreams, in minds, and most dangerously in memory. She returned to the shed. The symbols were clearer now. She traced them with her fingertips and spoke them aloud, syllable by syllable. The trees didn't move, the sky didn't shift, but something did, a pressure in the ground, a weight in the air, a pulse in her chest. The language was no longer something she heard, it was something she carried. And it was still growing. Evelyn had exhausted every lead but one, the family. Until now she had assumed the journals, the cylinder, the trunk had simply passed down through academic obsession. But late one night, she opened a narrow folder labeled Only Adoption Papers 1911. Her great-uncle Walter Hart had taken in 2 girls that year. No birth records, no origin documents. Only a note from the state, found wandering east of Harrisburg after a fire destroyed the convent at St. Agnes. Evelyn's breath caught. She flipped to the photo clipped behind the paperwork, grainy, faded, but unmistakable. 2 girls, identical. Pale skin, dark eyes, same faces, same expressions. Lisa and Annalisa. But the date read 1911, 7 years after they vanished from Austria. She searched frantically through the rest of the file. The girls had stayed with Walter for 6 months. Then, one day, they were gone. No records of departure, no forwarding address. Only a single line in Walter's diary. They said they had to return before the window closed. I didn't understand then. I do now. Evelyn sat frozen. The air pressed in as if the house itself were listening. They hadn't died in the fire. They hadn't vanished. They had crossed not just borders, not just oceans, but time, the drawings, the language, the structure of their speech. It wasn't just foreign. It was displaced, outside the bounds of history, as if they carried a system of meaning that obeyed different rules, different calendars, different physics. She turned back to the earliest letters from Boimler and reread a phrase she'd overlooked. They arrived bearing knowledge, unmoored from chronology. Had they been moving through time? Or had time been moving around them? She thought back to the waveform, the embedded pulse, the distortions in mirrors, the moment her clock had reversed, the dreams that ran backward. The growing certainty that the twins' language didn't follow time, it created its own. She opened the envelope from the adoption records again. This time she noticed the back of the photo was marked with a strange shape. 2 overlapping spirals, bound at the center. She checked the journal, same symbol. And beside it, Boimler had scrawled a question. If language shapes perception, what does a language outside time perceive? Her mind reeled. Was the language a key? A mechanism not just of speech, but of access, into spaces unanchored by chronology? And if so, how had Walter come into contact with them again? Had he sought them, or had they sought him? She walked to the attic and found the wax cylinder still in its box. She stared at it for a long time. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. On the edge, she noticed something she hadn't before. A faint carving in the wax, visible only at an angle. 2 letters, EH her initials, but the wax was over 50 years old. She dropped it. It rolled to the floor and came to a gentle stop. She didn't move. In her mind the phrase returned, not whispered this time, but spoken clearly, as if standing directly behind her. "We knew you before." She turned, heart hammering. No one there. But the mirror across the room held her reflection. And something else. 2 faint outlines beside her, motionless, hand in hand, watching, waiting. Days passed without time. Evelyn no longer trusted the sun or the ticking of clocks. One morning she awoke to light outside, though her bedside watch read 2:14 a.m. Another, she swore she'd slept for minutes, only to find the entire day gone. The language was no longer external. It had nested. Then, at the bottom of a hidden drawer in her great-uncle's desk, she found it. A final wax cylinder wrapped in velvet, different from the others. Its surface bore no labels, just a faint, perfect spiral etched into the center. Her hands shook. She hesitated for hours before placing it into the phonograph. The moment the needle dropped, she felt it. Not sound, shift. 2 voices emerged, but this time they weren't speaking the indecipherable rhythm of before. They were clear, soft, English. "Evelyn," they said. She froze. "We are sorry. You were not supposed to find us." The tone was calm, gentle, but final. She listened, unmoving. "You opened a path we closed long ago. The words were never meant to be read, only remembered." A pause. "We knew you before. We will know you again, but this place cannot hold the echo." Then the voices overlapped, repeating a phrase in their original language, haunting, rhythmic, layered with that impossible sub-frequency. The room darkened, not visibly, perceptually. The walls seemed farther away, the floor uncertain beneath her feet, the air pulled in. Her breath shortened. Objects on her shelves vibrated gently, without motion. Her own heartbeat no longer aligned with her body. She felt it elsewhere, outside herself. Then the voices stopped. The phonograph fell silent. And Evelyn understood. They hadn't left behind messages. They had left triggers, keys, activations, not memories of a language, the language itself, living, waiting. And now, awake. The house shifted around her. Door frames bent ever so slightly. Wallpaper patterns realigned into mirrored symbols. The floor creaked with no pressure. Windows reflected scenes not visible from their angles, not her reflection, but something approximating it. She ran to the attic. There the journals lay open, pages fluttering in an unseen wind. The wax cylinders hummed. Not with sound, with presence. And on the far wall something new, a phrase written in chalk that hadn't been there before. To cross is to remain. She backed away, pulse thundering. Then the mirror at the end of the attic, cracked and spotted with age, shimmered. 2 figures emerged behind her reflection, Liesa, Anneliese, smiling. Their mouths didn't move, but Evelyn heard them. Not with ears, with thought. "You are us now." She turned to run, but the staircase looped back onto itself. Every floor was the same rug, the same lamp, the same portrait of Walter Hart. Though now, in the frame, he was smiling too. The phonograph began again. She hadn't touched it. It played without needle, without cylinder. Only one word echoed now, over and over. Remain. 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 Evelyn covered her ears, screamed. No sound came. She wasn't silent. She was elsewhere. She stumbled to her desk, desperate, clawing at paper, ink, breath. She had to write it down, to leave something behind, a warning. She opened her journal and began to write, but the words came backwards, and they weren't in English, they weren't in German, they were theirs. The house stood silent for 3 days. The mail piled at the door. The lights inside flickered at irregular intervals. Neighbors noticed nothing strange, except that the wind around the old Hart estate no longer sounded like wind. It hummed. A former student of Evelyn's, Dr. Clara Munro, arrived on the 4th day. She had received a letter, scrawled, half-finished, sent days earlier. It wasn't a farewell, it wasn't coherent, but it carried a single phrase repeated across the margins. They are in the reflection of thought. Clara knocked. No answer. She entered with a spare key Evelyn had once entrusted to her. The air inside was stale, heavy with something that had no scent yet clung to the lungs. Every step she took seemed to echo twice, once normally and again just slightly off tempo. The house was intact, but Evelyn was gone. No sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no open windows. The journals were still in the parlor, the photographs scattered, the wax cylinders lined neatly in their box. Only one thing was out of place, her journal. It lay open on the writing desk, half a page filled with indecipherable glyphs. At the bottom, a single English line: "The language cannot be closed once spoken." Clara called the local authorities. The sheriff's deputies arrived. A perfunctory search followed. No signs of forced entry, no missing belongings. Just the one thing they all agreed on. The attic felt wrong. Deputy Reardon, a veteran of 20 years, refused to go back up a second time. He described the sensation of hearing his own thoughts spoken in reverse, just out of reach. His partner claimed the mirror in the attic reflected the wrong angle of the room. The report listed Evelyn Hart as missing presumed voluntary departure. Clara didn't believe that. She took the journal. She took the cylinders. She took the photo Evelyn had last marked with the twins' names, and quietly she sent them to the FBI. It took weeks. Then a man appeared at her office, clean suit, no ID. He asked no questions. He only gave her a form marked "Received" and advised her not to speak of it again. Within days, Evelyn's house was emptied. No one saw who came. Clara returned weeks later, unable to resist the pull of what she'd read. The house was locked, but something inside had changed. The windows had been replaced, the walls repainted, the attic boarded shut from the outside. But even from the street, she swore she heard the phonograph turning. The official record remained unchanged. Missing woman, no foul play suspected. A cold case destined to fade. But Clara didn't let it fade. She archived everything, digitally and in print. She compiled the journal pages, transcribed what she could, and began contacting others. Quietly, carefully. Some listened, some never replied. One sent her back a single envelope, inside of which was a burned scrap of wax and a phrase: "She didn't disappear. She remained." That word stuck. Remained. It kept showing up. In the recordings, the letters, the dreams Clara began to have. She wrote them down. And one morning, she woke speaking in a voice that wasn't hers. The cylinder Evelyn left behind had already been digitized. It had already been shared. And the echo had begun again. By 1960, Evelyn Hart's name had vanished from public discourse. The university no longer listed her among its emeritus scholars. Her research was boxed and shelved, misfiled under obscure anthropology. The town barely remembered her, just an older woman who'd kept to herself, lived quietly, and disappeared without fuss. But the recordings didn't stay buried. They re-emerged in an unexpected place, a used bookstore in Philadelphia. A graduate student in linguistics named Daniel Price purchased a crate of discarded academic materials. Among outdated grammars and syntax manuals, he found an unlabeled reel of tape. Curious, he played it. The audio was rough, crackling, warped with time. But the moment he heard the twin voices, he stopped breathing. He listened again and again. Then, unable to resist, he transcribed. At first it was for a term paper on unknown phonologies, but the shapes intrigued him. He found patterns, structures, order, beauty. Within weeks his notebooks were filled with strange mirrored glyphs. He stopped attending class. He barely slept. The language took root. His roommates reported him whispering in his sleep, his voice shifting tone and pitch mid-sentence. He began referring to time as a fold, not a line. One night they found him drawing spirals on the ceiling in chalk. He claimed it wasn't chalk. It was memory dust. By mid-December, Daniel disappeared. His dorm room was locked from the inside. No signs of struggle, no packed bags, just a page on his desk, covered corner to corner in looping script. The dean of the university, upon seeing the page, said only, "We've seen this before." That same week, 2 other linguistics students began writing in similar symbols, independently, without speaking to each other. One of them claimed to have seen 2 girls in the language lab, standing motionless, watching. No one else did. But the spiral drawings started appearing on whiteboards, in notebooks. In the frost on windows, the campus went quiet about it. The file on Daniel Price's disappearance was marked unresolved, then archived. Clara Monroe, now teaching under a different name, heard of the case. She traveled quietly to Philadelphia, asked subtle questions, reviewed security logs. She found no evidence, no leads, no recordings, but she did find the notebook. And the symbols were the same. Evelyn's, Boimler's, the twins. The cycle was restarting, or maybe it had never stopped. The pattern wasn't linear. It was recursive. The language didn't move forward. It moved outward. Daniel was gone, yes, but not erased, transformed, passed through. And wherever he wasn't alone. There were always 2, and there would be more. Clara stopped her search there. She returned home, sealed her notes, and left a final entry in her private journal. It spreads not by sound, but by shape, not by message, but by memory. Thought becomes the carrier, and we are no longer immune. That night, she burned her archive. But before the flame consumed it, she made one copy. A microfilm reel. She mailed it to a linguistics consortium in Chicago, unsigned. By the time they opened the envelope, the building's night janitor had already filed a report. 2 girls had been seen on the 5th floor. No one else was in the building. No one ever saw them leave. Some stories end quietly, others never end at all. In 1963, a photograph surfaced in the Chicago Tribune. A blurry, grey-toned image taken at a street fair. Dozens of people moved across the frame in motion blur, except 2. Dead center, still, sharp. 2 girls, identical, pale, dark-eyed. No one recognized them. No names were published. The caption simply read, "Ghost Children at Logan Square." The photo went unremarked for years, until a researcher at the University of Illinois, compiling data on anomalous linguistic records, recognized the shapes embroidered on their collars, subtle mirrored glyphs stitched in grey thread, the same as those found on the sanatorium walls, the same as Evelyn's transcriptions, the same as Daniel's notebooks. The language had not faded. It had grown quieter, more efficient. No longer requiring sound, just form, just memory, just thought. In the decades that followed, the cases remained scattered, obscured by time, bureaucracy, and disbelief. But for those who knew where to look, the signs endured. Spirals in snowdrifts, phrases spoken in dreams, names unremembered by those who once loved them. And always, always the twins. Sometimes on the edges of old footage. Sometimes in the backgrounds of family photographs, never moving, never aging, only watching. Evelyn Hart was never found. Her journals were never published. Her name lives only in fragments now, whispered between researchers who don't publish and archivists who don't catalogue. She remains, not in a place, but in a pattern, a frequency, a grammar of recursion. Some say language is what makes us human. Others now wonder if it's what unmakes us, and perhaps the most haunting thought of all. The Halden twins were never the origin, only the first ones who remembered. if their language still echoes today. Subscribe for more mysteries that challenge our reality. And don't stop now. Click the next video on screen to dive deeper into another story lost to time.